So in this video, I'm going to discuss how combat works and talk about how the gameplay or the order of battle tends to progress, and then give you a few examples of the way the Colonial Born handles some of those things I talked about in the last video a little bit differently. So the order of combat, or I should say, actually, I'm in the wrong place here. So when you're taking an encounter, the encounter summary is basically what you're going to follow. Now, there's quite a few things that are going to change here. So I'm going to wrap this video up with kind of a top-down next steps and what's going to be translated and what's not into the final product. But in essence, there's going to be a before battle and then during battle and then a victory or defeat stages of the process. Before battle, the most obvious thing that we do is we stage the battlefield. So Colonial Born is played with miniatures. It's not necessary that you have 3D printable miniatures or high quality miniatures in the table. It's perfectly adequate if you want to stick a bunch of books, use a tape measure and a bunch of quarters and dimes and stuff to represent characters and enemies. That's perfectly cool. When I first started playing, we used a Chessex board with it was like a dry erase board that allowed us to do some drawings and stuff. And again, that was grid based, so it solved a lot of our drawing lines and stuff and figuring out distances. But it's perfectly fine to use a tape measure too. The staging the battlefield, though, is primarily about giving the players the opportunity to review their characters, take in the battlefield layout, start thinking about how they might proceed once the battle commences. In the current version of the game, and this is something I definitely do not intend on translating over right away, is the idea of the epic encounter. So epic encounters are the way I deal with big, massive scale battles, where I want to have squads and teams and huge numbers of things in the field. Now, in my traditional approach to the game, the way that I was doing it when it was all on paper was I would have to create a system that dealt with the scale of that, because there's an awful lot of pieces, there's an awful lot of tracking. So a lot of this was to distill some of those things down into manageable segments. But now that we are going through the process of creating digital sheets, I don't believe that it's going to be necessary for us to have a lot of the mechanics that are involved in epic encounters, because a lot of the problems are solved by the digital sheets, and it's hard to say how that's going to express until it's built and play tested. So with a grain of salt, I'll explain a little bit of what those epic encounter elements are, but keep in mind they probably won't translate to the first version of the product that you end up seeing a year from now. So the next stage in before the battle is the battle plan. So once the battlefield is staged, the game official or the GM will describe the setting, the player's objectives, and any rules or conditions that apply. They will also be supplied with any of their units to deploy their armies. At the same stage, we have to determine unit readiness. Unit readiness is a bit of a legacy format. I have found a way to solve this where I don't need to do exactly what is written here, but unit readiness was a way for us to determine how committed a character was when the battle started. So, characters could be flat-footed, prepared, or engaged. A flat-footed character would not be aware that a fight is occurring. A prepared character would know that there is an enemy nearby, but not know where. And an engaged character would know where the enemy is and know that they were in a hostile situation. And these conditions or states of unit readiness were useful in determining how different stealth functions would work. I've since solved many of these problems using the perception modifiers and including it directly in the stealth action. So now it's no longer necessary to track unit preparedness. It's a little bit more streamlined. Likewise, I don't necessarily need to talk about player aggression, I don't think. But then after that, we have the epic encounter form of unit deployment. This is when we are deciding if a character is going to be commander of their group and be able to issue orders to others, if they're just a hero, meaning that they're a single-based unit, or if they're in a warband, which means that they're a large group of units. This is about treating units as groups, and is one of the things that may not be able to translate. Then we move on to initiative and turn order. So initiative and turn order is done as many other tabletop role-playing games are, in that initiative is set by the roll of a die combined with a specific initiative modifier. Every species will have a different initiative modifier. Whoever rank orders highest in their final tally of the combination of the two values gets to go first. There is a number of different ways that we had to treat that differently with war bands, and it got a little confusing, so I had to create more complex rules. And then we shift into the battle. So during the battle, there's a beginning of the round, the beginning of the round, the combat phase, and then the post-combat phase, or the end of the round conditions. So most of this is not necessary, except knowing that when when battle's commencing, there is a beginning of the round stage, and then there is a combat phase, which has a beginning of your turn, during your turn, and at the end of your turn. And then there's a end of round phase when everybody's completed their actions. Now, if you've watched the previous video, you know that action pools mean that characters have more than one action. And this is where Colonial Born does something a little unique. So, because action totals are different for different characters, but the turn order is consistent, that means that some characters will get more turns than others. But the turn order isn't disrupted by this. So the traditional way that this was approached in my first iteration of the game was, if you had, say, 4 actions and I had 3 actions and you went first, you would take 4 actions and then I would take 3 actions. This effectively meant that anybody who was slower in the initiative order never got to use their actions. And when the game tied together initiative, or when the right build tied together initiative and action totals, so that they're both derived from a core stat, then one person could just ramp up all their actions and make sure they went first, and they would win every time. So the approach to fixing this came to a turn order difference. So it basically became, if you have 4 actions and I have 3 actions, then you go, take your first, I take my first. Then you take your second, then I take my second, then you take your third, then I take my third, and then you take your fourth. I don't have a fourth, so I don't get a fourth. You can see in this layout here, the way that APR translates to how those actions may be taken in that order. Now, I mentioned the presence of parry, dodge, and clash. So parry, dodge, and clash are forms of opportunity action. I'm going to jump ahead here to pull up the opportunity action section. So basically what an opportunity action is it allows you to, under certain conditions, take your turn out of order. So to use an example of dodge, when you are the target of a successful action, you may take a costed opportunity action to dodge. Both the attacker and the defender will roll 1d100 and they will add their dodge modifier. The higher value wins. If the attacker succeeds, then the damage is processed normally. But if the defender succeeds, then the attack is regarded as a miss. So what this would do, if, to use the original example of you having 4 actions and me having 3, if you attacked me and missed, and then I attacked you and hit, you could say, I've been hit, I'm going to dodge. So then we do our dodge rolls using our dodge modifier. and I fail for whatever reason. I roll poorly. So you've been able to successfully dodge. So that happens, but it doesn't happen in the existing turn order. So it happened on my turn. Then it goes over to you, and you take action number 3 because you have 4 actions, but you've used 2 of them. Now, I haven't taken my second action yet. So it's going to end up being that you take an action, I take an action, you take an action, I take an action, and you've got none left. So by taking them out of order, basically we think about actions as there's only a limited number of them, and that's the number we can spend. And this ends up being a really useful way to create some really unique confrontations. So I have a character who has prioritized dodge and parry very heavily, to the point where I have very poor defenses and my armor is rubbish. And so I have poured everything into trying to make sure that my parry and dodge are up and my action pool is good, so that when it comes down to it, if I'm hit, I can dodge or I can parry my way out of it. And I can take the choice of dodge or parry based on what the opponent's dodge or parry values seem to be playing out as. And this is interesting because we have another player on our team who's all about damage reduction. Like, they have a really high armor stat. So they don't care if they get hit because they just reduce it all down to very manageable numbers. And then we have a third character, and that character's pretty defense oriented. So it's hard to hit them. But when you do, they have manageable armor and they really can't parry or dodge very well. The consequence of this is that the very first person in the battle is the guy who has the reducers, because he's going to draw all the aggro. And so he goes out there and he acts like a tank until something happens that disrupts his armor or messes his armor up. And so once his armor is disrupted, then we're more dependent on the defense person. And in the meantime, I'm just kind of running all around and doing my attacks. Well, in a situation like has just happened in our last session, we basically had this exact scenario play out, except both of the other characters got badly hurt. And so they were sitting back and healing, and I was in the fight, but I couldn't actually deal enough damage to the boss to be able to get past its own reducers. So when I was going in and trying to hit this thing, I wasn't doing any damage. So it became a delay action where I'm occupying them, preventing them from moving, and dumping all my actions into dodge and parry and moving all around and being annoying, long enough to be able to buy them time. The necessity for me of trying to find a way to continually occupy the boss turned into the most incredible moment, because I was trying to get out of this whole thing. And then suddenly it occurred to me, wait a minute, I have the adhesion power and we're really close to a wall. So I'm going to run up the wall and I'm going to take like a coordination challenge, grab a hold of his cloak and pull it over his head so he can't see. So that'll waste an action, right? So that's exactly what I did. And then of course the character's tearing off the cloak and that, worked quite well in creating an occupying action. Then I'm like, well, what else can I do to occupy this guy? So sleight of hand. I moved in, popped the magazine out of his gun. Then I moved back a little bit because I have some good movement. Now he's got to run and catch up to me to hit me, or he's got to replace the magazine. Great. Again, doing quite well. This goes back and forth of me just being totally irritating to this boss until eventually it settled on, wait a minute, I still have 2 actions left and the boss is done. So I'm like, well, what if I try and pull his armor strap? So I run in there, coordination check, go for I'm asked to do an attack roll by my friend who's GMing. I succeed critically. Off comes the armor, and then I turn around and I say, 1 action left. I'm grabbing my sword, I'm taking a swing, and I'm going to try a dismemberment strike. Well, wouldn't you know it, I succeeded, and I cut the armor. Not only did I cut past the armor, because it's no longer there, I successfully dismembered the target. So I cut off its leg. So the boss I couldn't damage out of sheer feat of ingenuity and just acting, and I killed it before the two people who were needed were able to heal. So this was like a fantastic moment, but it was produced by this interplay in action totals and action order. And so this is something we very much want to preserve. But there's a mechanical issue with it in that it becomes hard to track. And this is where I think the character sheets, the digital character sheets, really can help us perform, because we get all the benefits on the digital sheet of having this interactive stuff, all the stuff I just described to you of, parry, dodge, and clash, being able to use those kinds of things, having different ways to approach defense. All those benefits can be there and different ways to express your character. But under the hood, the digital sheet is going to solve the issue of turn management, initiative control, figuring out whose actions what at any given point in time, and be able to handle it for a large group of people. So this is one of the areas where the digital sheets are going to be really critical to making a better experience for players. After we go through the combat phase, we have a shell shock phase, which is only for the epic. This idea came to us from our experiences playing Warhammer and Age of Sigmar. Specifically the idea of forcing people to leave because they're shocked by what's going on in the battlefield became a really interesting idea. And so we lifted some of that at the encouragement of some of my friends and put it in here. Again, this would not be translated over. It's routing warbands and stuff. A lot of this is fundamentally about weakening morale. And there are different ways that we are now doing that inside of the game. So there's different victory conditions. I won't get too far into those. I don't think they're particularly important. But let's talk for a minute about how we execute an actual action. So the act of executing an action is typically proceeds in this way. There's targeting, there's the attack roll, and then there's processing the damage. So to begin with targeting, if a character is targeting, they have to learn whether they're targeting in reach or range. Reach is used primarily for melee actions. Range can be used for power actions or for range attacks. Range is very dependent on a weapon or a power, which sets the range. Reach is dependent on the size of the object being used as an implement and the reach of the character by default. So, some of our larger characters might have a default reach of 2. Most only have a reach of 1, but the reach is going to be larger if you're carrying an axe than it would be if you were carrying a dagger. Then we draw a line. So lines can either be impaired or they can be blocked. So drawing lines are connected to senses. So as I mentioned before, we have line of sight, smell, sound, tremor, heat, and energy. Each of these are different for each species. You will have certain things that impair certain lines more effectively than others. For instance, a line of sight is blocked by bushes. A line of heat is not. And so there's a degree of complexity here that I don't know if it's going to survive playtesting, because it's more in the simulation side of game design than it is anything else. But it does produce interesting things like line of energy, which is a form of telelocation for telepaths. That makes it very easy to draw a certain kind of line. It also simplifies the language of certain actions and makes it easier to describe things in fewer words. And so there are things like natural, preferred, impaired, or unimpaired lines. So a natural line has no innate advantage. An unimpaired line means that it doesn't have an advantage, but it's basically a 0. An impaired line would be impaired by a number, so -2, -3, -4. That would change the attack roll. You'd have to modify your roll by that number. And then a preferred line would give you a boost. So if you had a +2 line of sight and you rolled a range attack with a gun, then you would add 2 to your attack roll. And so this is how you would prefer or impair. This is the line drawing and targeting. You can target areas as well. Targeting an area means that you're going to do hazard damage instead of regular damage, which is only half standard damage to a character occupying that spot. But it is easier to strike because attack rolls are all drawn up on a 10 or a 20, which means even odds of hitting something before it is impaired or before proficiencies or before defenses are included. It's a 10 out of 20. When you're attacking an area, it's not dodging, it's not moving, there's no challenge there, so it's 10 out of 20. If you roll a 10 on a d20 to try and hit that area, you've got it. But proficiencies aren't going to help you. All that stuff's not going to help you. You're just trying to roll that 10 out of 20. Sometimes hitting areas is a lot easier than hitting characters. We have a little spot here for epic targeting. I won't cover that. Again, that's about warbands and how to target warbands. So then we move on to the attack roll. So attack rolls are performed with a d20. Everybody has even odds of success or failure, which is usually a 10 out of 20. Originally, I had it 11 out of 20. I think there's still a typo in here for that. These odds are modified by the attacker and the defender's combat values. So if you have a melee attack, for instance, of a +2, and your opponent has a melee defense of a +5, then you're rolling a d20 and adding your +2, and they're taking the even odds, which is 10, and adding the +5. So you have to roll to beat a 15, and with your +2, that means you need to roll a 13 or higher. That's as straightforward as it can be, but as is the case in almost all of these areas, you're going to have weapon proficiencies that factor into this. You're also going to have power proficiencies, which factor into this. And these are different ways that you can invest your points and proficiency points and stuff into various things as you progress as a character. That means that some of these proficiencies will stack. This is another area where there's yet another form of interface with the character sheet where you're tracking a lot of separate elements, in which a digital character sheet solves that really quickly by essentially stacking all those things right from the get-go and processing them for you. So this will hopefully increase the speed of combat. And therefore improve the engagement, the speed of battle. As is the case in most games, if you roll a critical hit, a 20 out of 20, you're going to do damage and a half. If you critical miss, though, we have a system called misfortune cards. So weapons, powers, and abilities will all add to your misfortune deck. And your misfortune deck is essentially a series of different consequences. So if you critically miss with a 1 out of 20, then you will be forced to draw misfortune. If you are improvising, which I will cover in the powers video, if you're improvising, then if you miss, you will be forced to draw misfortune. So the consequences the risks are much greater for an improvisational act versus a trained act. Then we have warband attacks and warband defense. We're not going to worry about that. At this point, when the attack roll occurs after it concludes, we're checked for your opportunity actions. Opportunity actions are wide and varied, especially when you get into powers. And so I put it in here just because it's important to check for it. Right from the get-go, parry, dodge, and clash, every character has it. So opportunities are always going to show up at this spot. That's the only reason why it's in this lineup. But they could appear anywhere. It just depends on what the opportunity is being triggered, what trigger there is there for that opportunity. Then we end up in processing damage. So there are different damage types. So in the original writing, there was intensity, major, moderate, minor, critical, penetrating, fall, hazard, knockback, and then different treatments for knockback damage into obstacles and terrain versus into characters. I've made this simpler in language by saying instead intensity damage, intensity damage is full printed. Major damage was 50%. I now say half intensity damage or quarter intensity damage. It just makes it easier. So this is not so important. What is important is damage effects. So damage effects is now what we call conditions. And conditions are attached to damage. So pyrokinesis, for instance, as a power, has the burn condition. Whereas irradiating damage can deal both burn and atomic damage will deal both burn and irradiation. So the idea here is that these are persistent effects that are constantly being processed every round or every turn that a character acts. And so generally the rule is going back to the way that armor is processed. First, we do our damage reduction for armor. And then we process our carapace or whatever powers or stuff are on our person. And then after that, the damage is applied to our health. If damage gets through and damage is done, then a condition is applied. Otherwise, the condition is not applied. So, you're not going to start bleeding if it doesn't get through your armor, is basically what that means. However, if it does get through your armor, the condition stats are based on the total intensity, not the reduced intensity. It got very complicated in our early games when we were trying to do things like determine exactly how much bleed there is after only 3 damage got through. And it's moderate, so it's 25%. So then, so it's only 1 damage of bleed. But the original attack was like a 30. So, it should have been a 10, and now it's only 1. We decided it was a lot easier to use fixed values, which are based on the intensity of the attack, rather than have to process it through every single time. Because each time you add that extra processing step, where you end up doing more math and whatnot, you're just denigrating the flow of battle. So once the processing of the damage is complete, then you're looking for any things that are like secondary consequences or whatnot, or dealing with things like knockback where you're blown back. Aerokinesis causes a tremendous amount of knockback. And sometimes you will find that like things like prone you're caused to be prone, which means you're knocked on the ground. All these things process at the end of damage being dealt. And then, of course, there's the possibility that damage is not health damage. So there's a series of different kinds of actions that can be taken in game, which attack stats like vitality, physique, fortitude, coordination, ingenuity, perception, like your base stats. And this is something we do very differently in Colonial Born. So dismemberment is a great example of this, because dismemberment actually attacks the proficiency value, the number of hit dice that you actually have for your health, your total health. So as opposed to doing direct damage to your hit points, it's actually taking away your maximum hit points, which is, of course, thematic with dismemberment. There are also ways to attack your maximum energy. There's going to be ways to go after your basic stats to slow your movement. You can even remove actions from your action pool. Critically, though, one of the most consistent and common ways that we actually see this play out is by attacking base stats through things called speech actions or control actions. So I'll pull up one of the card examples here for speech actions. So this is a demonstration of a card system that I've been putting together and the way that it kind of works. And I'm going to give you an example that uses the speak action with the speech ability negotiate. And then I'm going to give you another example, which is the speak action followed by the speech ability demoralize. So the speech action is you take a speech half action. So this is how much you take from your action pool. So it's a half action. And then you select a target or targets. What's in brackets ultimately means that it has to be the ability that specifies whether or not you're hitting multiple targets or just the one. So you select a target within range, regardless of the line. Select a speech ability, we'll say negotiate, and then you roll an ingenuity challenge against the target. So an ingenuity challenge is a D100 roll where you add your ingenuity value. In this case, the speech ability over here says that it's opposed by the target's faculty. So they will roll, because it's an opposed challenge, a D100, and they'll add their faculty value. If you're successful, then you will reduce the target's fortitude by the proficiency of the action. And so this is essentially doing proficiency damage to the target's fortitude value. And you may ask yourself, why do I want to do that? Like, what use could that have? Well, let's look at demoralize. So demoralize, take a speech half action, select a target within range regardless of line, select a speech ability, demoralize, and roll an ingenuity challenge against the target. In this case, the skill may be used against any number of targets. So you can select as many targets as you like. And then it's opposed by their fortitude. Aha! If you've damaged their fortitude in advance, demoralize is easier to pull off. So once you're successful against all, then you're subtracting your proficiency from the target's next combat roll. So now you're making them generally weaker. The act of demoralizing is literally making the opponent worse at combat. And an action to negotiate weakens their fortitude. So you begin to see how speech actions start doing things like introducing politics. They make characters like bards play very differently than in other systems. And you can do all sorts of different things like harass, negotiate, threaten, insinuate, slander, signal, taunt, demoralize, reveal, inspire, or charm. And just using speech actions by themselves, there's a lot of manipulating stats. And it's stat manipulation that effectively doesn't care about armor. So don't worry about, damage reduction. Don't worry about melee defense. You're rolling challenges. You're rolling specific kinds of challenges. Now you can have a character who's effectively a glass cannon who's doing something that is very unconventional on that battlefield. Now, speech actions are generally used with the authority intention. So you really want to have a character who has that authority intention so that when you match it up with their speech actions, they learn a lot of experience from this and progress quite quickly. Another option would be control actions. So control actions are built around the idea of command query, secure, reprogram, malware. As you can see, it's primarily about hacking and manipulation of mechanics. This is really good if you're into forging because you can actually start building robots and things that are capable of keeping you very safe and then staying at a distance. There are characters that can be built that are operating more than one drone and primarily using those drones in order to interact with or fight with other things. It's not a spell that creates like an evocation or conjuration. You're deploying robots that you are using commands on that your opponents are trying to reprogram. And this is, it's very thematic for sci-fi, but it's also a different approach that is fundamentally based on taking unconventional action approaches and being able to target different stats. Why do I say it's about targeting different stats? Because let's read the command action. You take a control action and you select a valid, willing target within reach and line. Roll an unopposed fortitude challenge. If successful, the target, give the target an action that you know it's capable of, and then that action is considered a free action. So why does this matter? Well, it's that unopposed fortitude challenge. So unopposed means the opponent doesn't roll. you're just going against the core value, the stat. In this case, whatever matches it, fortitude. So if you can overcome their fortitude, then you're great. You can assign it an action. It's a valid willing target, but with a right power upgrade, you can suddenly change the way that this works by using override. When taking a command action, you can select an unwilling target. Now you're doing mind control, and it's based on their fortitude abilities. So you can see that ultimately you would want to damage their fortitude using negotiating tactics or other things like that to weaken their fortitude and then mind control them. And you're doing some serious damage using their skill set. So this is kind of the way that Colonial Born tries to take a different approach to combat, in that it essentially makes every stat available. So what's, going forward, what's the next steps action in the development of the game? Well, obviously, the mechanics of training actions is going to be super critical, because without an action trainer mechanic in place, without all the cards worked out, without them all testing and working inside of the digital character sheet, we won't be able to see just exactly how badly the game balance is thrown out by being able to attack fortitude or coordination or ingenuity. And so a lot of these things are going to require some amount of tweaking. There's also the question of whether or not we want to get into epic encounters and how that might look differently. So I think in the future, what I'm going to be confronting within the next year is a lot of play testing to try and resolve how some of these things will work. But hopefully when I get to a version that I can openly release, what we're going to be able to see is something that is balanced and capable of doing some very asymmetric kind of character designs. And that creates all sorts of opportunities for new and very different moments to be made between you and your characters.